Okay, we are live. Seems like we're live. Hello, everybody in the different platforms. We are broadcasting today this open telemetry session into, I think, like 3 or 4 different platforms. So you might watch us on Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, or whatever. I don't really know. Um, which makes it a little bit strange for us because like we're speaking to a screen and we know that there are people out there, but we can't see you folks. Um, anyway, you can always use the chat, and we can start in the next 2 minutes while we're waiting for folks. We can start by you writing us from where in the world you are joining us. This would be amazing to know. In the meantime, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Eran from Aspecto. With me here,
Michael,
Michael.
that's
Yeah.
me.
Michael is our open telemetry expert that is going to show you the way today. Oh, we have San Francisco Bear. That's great. I'm from San Francisco as well. Michael is actually joining us from Israel, but I'm from San Francisco and we have Belgium. Okay, so both sides of the pond. That's great. Let's wait another minute for folks to join in and we'll kick it off. Maybe some, just a beginning information. So this session is actually part of a wider series of sessions we're doing about open telemetry. Michael will share it later on, but the main thing was the Open Telemetry Bootcamp, where we covered different topics of how to get started with Open Telemetry. This session today is going to be a little bit unique because we're going to discuss mainly things regarding to actually adopting Open Telemetry and adopting it within your organization. It would be less about getting started and the code itself, but more about the challenges and how to actually use it. This session, although, as I mentioned, we can see you folks, you can write us. So this is like an open session. If you have anything to ask, if you want us to double click or anything wasn't clear, just write it on the chat. We will try to address and answer each one of your questions. So please keep us honest and feel free to join in. Hey, Abhishek. So without further ado, I think we can start kicking it off. Are we ready, Michael?
Yeah, we are.
Okay,
Cool.
let's go ahead.
Okay, cool. So today's session would be about adopting open telemetry in your company, in your organization. The main reason that we chose to do this session is we just got this feedback. I'm interested in open telemetry. I tried it in my local a bit, but now I'm trying to convince my organization, my manager, and we want the whole R&D to start working with that, and we are hitting some barriers. So today, that's what we're going to discuss, to give you this kind of a view of how this process looks like. And as Ram mentioned, I'm Michael. I am the CTO and co-founder at Aspecto, a distributed tracing platform. And in the past 2 years, I did mostly open telemetry, and I helped ourselves to set up open telemetry, but also our customers, and gained some interesting insight. And today I'll share it with you. So what we are going to achieve today is first to make sure that we are all aligned on OpenTelemetry. So we will start by kind of reviewing what OpenTelemetry does and how it does it in a brief way. That's not going to be a lot of today's session. Once we are aligned on how OpenTelemetry works and what you can get with it, we're going to discuss why an organization need to adopt it, what we have today versus what we're going to get with OpenTelemetry, and what's the motivation, not from only from our perspective, but the organization perspective as well. Then we're going to talk about the challenges and making sure that you're going to have great success with OpenTelemetry. Okay, so let's get started. So first, let's make sure that we know what OpenTelemetry is. OpenTelemetry is a set of open source project by CNCF. CNCF is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which also responsible to many other projects that you may run in your environment, like Kubernetes, Prometheus, and a bunch of other. And OpenTelemetry is an open source that the very base, the very core of OpenTelemetry is a specification to how collect telemetry data. Telemetry data, I'm referring to whatever that you are collecting in order to understand how your application performs. So traditionally, that would be traces and logs. And we would see that OpenTelemetry extends that, but the very core is simply a specification, a protocol, a clear way how to collect, how to send, what is the data structure. And then a layer on top of that is not only to specify it, but to actually do it in runtime. In runtime, actually collecting the telemetry data in runtime means that you're going to implement an SDK, a library, a package within your code. And this package is going to collect all the different telemetry data for you. So we have the specification. On top of that, we have the implementation of collecting the data. Then this data needs to be sent somewhere. So we need to have a backend that would be the OpenTelemetry collector that is going to ingest all this data and then probably send it somewhere. And we will see in a second a bit how this architecture looks like. But this is an overview of OpenTelemetry and its different components. In terms of architecture and how it looks like, so when coming to implement OpenTelemetry, you would see that this is actually kind of a stack. It's not like usually when we think on open source, we think on a single component that you implement in your code and that is it. But this is more like a full stack solution. You have your application, which you want to observe. You want to have telemetry data from there. So you're going to implement the OpenTelemetry SDK within your services, and this would be service A, B, and C. And this OpenTelemetry SDK is going to emit the telemetry to the OpenTelemetry collector. That's the backend. The backend will then receive it and then going to send it to a database, to a vendor, to open source, to both vendor and open source. You can do whatever you want from that point. But this is the overall deployment that you're going to experience once you're going to start having OpenTelemetry in your organization. Now, OpenTelemetry became very trendy, and just to prove you how much, so OpenTelemetry is part of the CNCF. All of those dots are different projects within the CNCF. You can see that the most active one is Kubernetes, which of course we all know. The second one would be OpenTelemetry. So the project is very, very active in terms of contributions and commits and overall amount of people and companies that are investing in this project. And to put it in perspective of GitHub, so we can look at OpenTelemetry specification. Again, the core of OpenTelemetry is to specify how to collect the data. And here you can see the OpenTelemetry specification graph in terms of stars in GitHub. So you can see the growth that we're having. So that's to convince you that OpenTelemetry is out there. And it's not only to convince you, right? We're talking about how to lead the OpenTelemetry adoption in your company. So as a manager in your organization, you want to bet on a project that is trending and is actually starting to gain real traction, and those graphs show it. So you can use those graphs to convince your boss. So I said telemetry data, and I said that traditionally we're talking about logs and metrics, which I'm assuming you're familiar with it. It's been there for a long time. But telemetry data doesn't stop there. So probably the claim to fame of OpenTelemetry would be traces, distributed traces. In a second, I'll show you what a trace looks like in case you haven't seen one. And usually some people would think that OpenTelemetry is only tracing. In fact, it can collect metrics and logs together. And there are more types of telemetry data that are going to be included in the OpenTelemetry project, such as code profiling. So we have this one project trying to collect everything so you could work with it. So in case you are not familiar with traces, let me introduce you to a trace. So as you can see here, this is a visualization of a trace. The visualization is from the product Jaeger, not the product, the open source Jaeger, a tool that is commonly used to visualize traces, also part of the CNCF foundation. So here you can see a trace, and when you're looking at a trace, you can see here that we have this tree view, and we can see different events that happened. So this is a single transaction that started from a specific service in a specific endpoint, and now you can see how this event, how this API call propagated throughout your system. So we can see that the order service communicated with the user service to verify the user. And you can see then that only after the user service had responded, only then the order service communicated with the stock service to update the stock. And eventually we ran some MongoDB query. So looking at what we are seeing here, we are seeing three main things. So we can see the events, right? We can see what happened. And you can claim that this is very, very similar to logs, right? Logs, in some sense, they are events that happen in the system. There are two important things that we are getting here that we're not getting from logs. When we are looking at specific event, and this should be referred as a span, I'll explain in a second. And when we are seeing a specific span, I'm not only seeing that this DB query occurred, but I also understand why it occurred. It occurred because the stock service got an API call to a specific route to the update stock. And the stock service didn't get this update stock from the front end, for example, it got it from the order service. So we are understanding what happened, and we're understanding the context, we're understanding why things happened. And the reason that I'm not referring to each row as events, but as spans, because they span over time. Again, log is a particular event in a point of time, but a span started specific time, such as log, but then it has duration. It spans over some period of time. And this is why they are called spans, and this is why they are very, very powerful in terms of helping us with performance, because we understand each event, why it happened, and how long it took. So this is to make sure that we are all aligned. What is OpenTelemetry, a bit of the architecture, and what tracing is. So now that we understand what it is and what data it's going to provide us, then the question would be what we're going to do with that. Okay, I have this data, I have this visualization, so what? So you would usually use it to identify and solve production issues or any issue with your software. So logs and metrics are tools to kind of tell us, hey, you have a problem. Here are the clues. Here is the details that we have to tell you about this problem, so we'll be able to solve it. And eventually, what we're trying to hit the MTTR of the organization, the mean time to recover. I had an incident. It took me time to understand it. It took me time to deploy it, to deploy a fix, and then to make sure that the issue is in fact resolved. So we're using this data exactly for that, to solve and to identify the issues. So, okay, we did that. And then the question that you may hear from, I don't know, other people or your manager is, how is that different from an APM, any kind of performance monitoring tool or monitoring in general? Because, application performance monitor has been there for a lot of time. So what's new? What's different? So there are a few things that I would answer. The first one, and this is a huge promise from OpenTelemetry, is that we're talking for the first time on something that is in fact vendor neutral. Determining the specification is an effort of the community. It's not an effort of a vendor. No big company is behind this specification. So this is a community effort, making it that no vendors own the specification or the data. So when you're implementing OpenTelemetry, what you can do, you can now change vendors with more ease. It wouldn't be like very easy. It could still have its own problem because you know a specific product, you rely on this product. But moving the data, the same data, from one vendor to another is a very simple change in the configuration file. And if you look at other things, going the route of vendor neutral, this is something that we are doing a lot of time, right? We started moving to the cloud. Everybody was okay. Let's use the cloud, and we had this cloud lock, and now we're talking about being cloud agnostic, right? So then Kubernetes emerged because we can now run the same application on different clouds. Same thing here. You have your IPM tool, your monitoring solution, you're locked to it, and now we want to have a different option. So that's the first thing that I would say why it's different. The second thing is, if you look on any company that doing anything remote to monitoring, you would see that they are relying on OpenTelemetry and the OpenTelemetry protocol. Even the big players, the cloud providers, so CloudWatch and X-Ray from AWS can ingest OpenTelemetry. Google Stackdriver can ingest OpenTelemetry and can produce OpenTelemetry data. App Insight of Azure is the same. So all the big vendors, the cloud providers, and the monitoring solutions are all aligning to be compliant with this protocol. And the last thing is that we are talking about single SDK that is now collecting all the telemetry data all together. If I were to ask you today, where your logs are sent, you will say something, we're sending the logs to an ELK using InfluentD. And where's your metrics? We're using some Prometheus client to store it in Prometheus. So you have different clients and different SDKs to emit the telemetry data. Now we have a single SDK collecting it together and sending it together, which gives us the ability to actually correlate them. And let me show you an example when I'm saying to correlate the data, what it means. So here is an example that you can see in the background some log statement that we have. So we have some data. This is some demo data, so nothing too interesting here. But you can see here that we have the trace ID. So the application wrote some log saying that something happened. And this is from a specific container, a specific service. And it's part of a bigger transaction, let's say having 5 services. I don't know those 5 services looking at this log, but here you can take the trace ID and then jump to your to your tracing vendor, and then look at a specific trace and see the related logs. That way, I can jump from logs to traces with ease, and I'll talk about that a bit with more details later, because it's a very important thing, the correlation between logs and traces. And just to give you an example, here is the other way around, where you can actually look and observe a specific trace, and from the trace, see the logs as well. So this works 2 ways, and you can actually use it in any way you want. Okay, so up till now, if you're kind of in this area and everything I told you so far isn't new, you're probably at in the first phase. And we're talking about 5 phases to have an organization fully adopting OpenTelemetry. The first phase is just to be aware. I know OpenTelemetry, I heard about it, I didn't actually play with it. Maybe I play with it in my local environment or did some demo or something of that sort. But I still didn't get time for my organization, allocated time to POC this OpenTelemetry and to make sure that it's actually there. And then we're going to talk about now how to get the POC approved, how to get it running in your organization. Then to make sure that we see the first sign of value, that OpenTelemetry does in fact provide the value that we are looking for. Then how we're going to move to a full deployment where all services are emitting OpenTelemetry, and we have a full view in terms of the data. And after we have all the data, we want to make sure the entire organization or the R&D is aware of OpenTelemetry, aware of the traces, aware of the integration that we made, and making sure that everybody is actually using it. Okay, so first step to start the POC. So the first step is to admit the fact that isn't that fun. Adopting OpenTelemetry isn't always is very simple. It could be even sometimes hard. And I think there are three main things that makes OpenTelemetry hard to be adopted. The first one is that the project is not that mature. I'm not going to claim that the project is not stable enough, or that you shouldn't run in production or anything remotely. The opposite. We have customers running OpenTelemetry production in a very large scale productions, and it works great. However, the documentation and the explanations and the content and examples around OpenTelemetry are not enough. They're still kind of new. They are not always that articulated that well. Sometimes they are still broken. The effort that the community had done so far in terms of docs and examples is just not enough. You are going to find yourself looking at the documentation and finding it not clear enough. And this is something that is making it hard to adapt, because I, as someone who adopts OpenTelemetry, I need to understand it, I need to make it work, and when I'm lacking documentation, it's just making my life harder. So I think that's the first thing. It's just hard to learn. The second thing is in specific telemetries, those that are still not in GA, that are still in beta, and that would be logs at this stage, they may be breaking changes that could occur. So just be aware of the state of the telemetry that you are working with. The second fact that making it hard to adapt it is OpenTelemetry is a complex project. First of all, it's a full stack solution. We have the front end that collecting the data, and we have a backend that ingesting the data, and then we need to distribute it. There is all kind of things that we need to configure and understand, that just making it how to set up, a lot of new terms that you will need to learn, and all of that making it that the learning curve, the initial learning curve, is hard. I will point one thing. It's going to be hard for the person or the team that is going to implement it. Once it's implementing and data is flowing, consuming it is easy. So that's for those who are implementing it, which in terms of POC, that's the effort that we need to make. That's a sell that we need to do to the organization. And lastly, and this is something that I've learned the hard way, usually OpenTelemetry is installed on multiple services because you're using some distributed applications, some microservices. And in this case, when you're implementing something and you're doing some mistake, if you already implemented it on, let's say, 50 services, then you're going to duplicate the mistake to 50 services, and then you need to fix it for 50 services. So one mistake could lead to many changes. So try to avoid the mistake, try to get advice before you are finalizing how you are setting it up. So what I'm trying to say here is that you need to convince the organization that you are about to take some investment into this project, and that you need to have a good return on that investment. And that means that you need to show the value. You're going to say, hey, I need 3 weeks to implement that. We'll wait a second with why you said 3 weeks. But what am I going to get with that? What is the value that I'm going to show? So to show the value, to kind of go to your manager and say, this is how our organization would look once we have open telemetry, I would attack it with 2 points. The first one is open telemetry in the long run will save us time and effort. Why? Because of 2 reasons. The first one is every company has this old story that the R&D had some issue and it took way too much to solve it. We had a downtime, we had data loss. I don't know what was the whole story that you were experiencing, but you probably had one. And going back to that and making sure that OpenTelemetry in fact could have helped. And usually that would be specifically traces. Usually you would see the value in the traces, and then going there and saying, hey, this is what we could have done. That could be a good sell. The second thing is not going to this whole story that everybody remembers, but rather go to the day-to-day small incident that we're all having. And you would find that developers tend to first go to look at the logs. I have some incident, now I'm looking at logs, and the amount of time that it takes me to understand the incident or the exception on the bug or whatever it is from logs, if that can be reduced by traces, then the overall effort the R&D is putting on incidents can be reduced. And this could be significant, and at least for our customer, this is what is mostly affecting the R&D. So those 2 are good points to sell when talking about saving time and effort. The third thing, or the second point, would be that it's a good move because we are vendor agnostic. Ask your manager, how much do you pay currently to your monitoring solution? It would be probably too much, and now we have the ability to implement some tools, some protocol that will allow us to change vendors or use different vendors for different telemetry data. So this is kind of trying to sell that the value is significant, and if you proven that the value could be significant, then what will happen is that you'll get an easier access to time to approve this POC. Okay, so now let's say that you convinced your manager. You said, okay, I see the value, I'm willing to invest, and now you have some time to show actual initial value. And I want to have kind of rule of thumb how to start with OpenTelemetry. And I'm mostly referring to big systems. Like if you have 5 services and your R&D is 10 developers, you probably can just go ahead and deploy everything on production. It would work. But if you have tens, dozens of developers and services, then you need to kind of ask yourself how to start, because just going all out and deploying all services could lead you in a bit of a trouble. So I would say start small. Find a specific part of the system that is communicating with one another. And if this part of the system is prone to have incidents, is more complex, people, when they get the bug over there, they catch their head and say, oh, I hate this service. This is a good place because you would find more value there. So find a specific part that is communicating with one another. It would be way easier to set it up if 2 things occur. If the communication between the services is synchronous, by that I mostly mean HTTP communication. Async communication in OpenTelemetry is a bit more complex and has a bit less support. So I would start with HTTP-based stuff. And it would be better if this part of the system has the same stack, the same language, the programming languages, and the same database, and so on. That would reduce the complexity of the initial implementation, but would still give you everything you need to prove the value. And proving the value, I would go with three things that we usually see that occurring. The first is you or other developer can say that they understand the system better. The simple step of just visualizing a trace, visualizing the transaction, make it easier to understand how the system behaves. And this is something that is usually easy to prove, and people are kind of willing to say that I saw the trace, okay, I understood it. And I'm jumping to point number 3 here because this is my favorite one. You would find that in some cases, you would implement OpenTelemetry and somebody else would, or even you, would look at the trace and say there is a bug in the trace. This API call is communicating with the database only once and not twice, and you can see that is calling the database twice. And this is the truth about OpenTelemetry. The trace would probably be correct. You just had a wrong assumption on how things are really operating. And most of our customers, when they are implementing it, they're they're reaching out and saying, hey, we think there is a bug there. And in almost 100% of the cases, there isn't a bug. It's just teaching you how the system really behaves. And this is something that you should be proud of because you implemented a technology that is actually educating you about your own system. The last thing that I would mention here is, as I said, developers, their go-to would be logs, and being able to jump from log to traces would reduce your time to fix significantly, and I would try to prove that because this is a very good point to show. Okay, so we had a small implementation of OpenTelemetry. We were able in few cases to observe traces and really learn something new. So we have this initial value. And now we need to go full scale and deploy it on all of our services. And this is a point in time that you should probably stop for a second and think. What did we learn from the initial implementation, how we fix those mistakes, and getting ready to a broader deployment? So let's start from trying to kind of estimate what it means a full deployment. So here is a list of things that you should think of before going all out and deploying on all the services and your entire production. The first one is OpenTelemetry has different support to different programming languages and different components in your architecture. So implementing OpenTelemetry in Node, in Ruby, in Python, and in Java is very, very easy. In Java, you would see that there is a very broad support to different components. In Ruby, you would find out there is less. In Go, the implementation is quite hard. So different components, by components, I mean your database, your cloud providers, your messaging broker, different languages and different components would have different support. And this is something that you can easily check out. You can go to the OpenTelemetry registry and look in the registry what is supported in your stack. Then you need to ask yourself a question. How many teams or people are involved in setting up OpenTelemetry? The more people, the more team that you need to have in order to install OpenTelemetry, the longer it's going to take. We have customers that installed OpenTelemetry on their production environment in a day on 20 services with 10 developers. Yeah, you could do that in a day. And we had customers struggling for a month to make it happen. So this is another significant factor. If you need other people, you need to allocate time. Number of different languages, number of different services are going to increase it. Whether you're going strictly with vendors, strictly with open source, or a combination of the two, The more you tend to open source, the more work you have. The more you go to vendor, you'll have less work, but more locked to that vendor. The higher your scale is, the more complex the solution that you will need to have, mostly in terms of receiving the data, the OpenTelemetry scale, also the database that is going to store it, and the different configuration that you will need to play with in order to meet your scale. And lastly, there are options to get data from non-OpenTelemetry SDK, not implementing an SDK within your code, but actually proxies and service meshes like Istio, like Envoy, like Nginx. All of those can produce OpenTelemetry data. Adding those to the play can make things a bit more complex. Eran, I think that you're on mute.
And I'm back. Sorry about it. Actually, you just touched service mesh issue, and we had a question about that earlier on. If you can elaborate a little bit about those challenges, if you have service mesh, you're using eBPF, you have some other agents that emits telemetry data, how can you go about it? How can you start and make some order in it?
Yeah. So the thing is that when you are producing OpenTelemetry from OpenTelemetry SDK, you're in charge of how the data look like, what data it's going to emit, what configuration. When you're talking about a third-party tool, your options are starting to decrease, and you're going to find yourself that a certain configuration is you're bound to work with that configuration because you're now strictly working with Istio. And let me explain. So when you're sending telemetry data between services, it's being encoded into the message, into the HTTP message or other type of messages. And this encoding could be different. So in OpenTelemetry, the default one would be W3C, and you would never know about it because it's the default one. But with Istio, at least for the time of this talk, it's not W3C, it's B3. Now, if those configuration wouldn't align, it wouldn't work. So your tracing would be broken. So what happens is with Istio, you can change it from B3 to W3C. So you would have to go to your OpenTelemetry SDK and make this change. And again, making this change is not that complex. It's a few lines of code, but doing that in 100 services that you need other team to do it, that's getting it really complex. So if you are planning on having Istio and those kind of things, I would make sure that I understand what they're requiring before I set up my own OpenTelemetry. And we actually have like a big blog that we wrote about it that we can share in the chat.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, we already shared the info. All of you guys can find it on the chat.
Okay, cool. So those are the factors that making it hard to deploy from the perspective of OpenTelemetry. And I do want to kind of talk about a bit about the scale and the cost. So when we're talking about scale and cost, so first of all, you need to have a lot of data yourself, a lot of traffic yourself in order for this to be an issue. If your traffic is low, that is not a concern. So the main problem is that talking about telemetry data is emitting tons of data. So let's say that you got a single API call that is going and fetching some record from Redis. So you got an API, you sent an API call to Redis, and you responded. In the background, you will have at least 2 spans created. And at least 2 spans, that's a very optimistic case. Usually there will be more. So for every interaction you are having, you're going to have more spans created. And that is leading to a lot of traffic. And to manage it, it's taking both time and effort and actual resources, right? Whether you're working with a vendor, you need to pay to this vendor, or you need to spin up your own infrastructure. This is a cost that you need to pay. So the more scale you have, the more complex setting up OpenTelemetry is going to be, at least the backend side, and it's going to be very costly. OpenTelemetry, at least the traces part, is so costly that you can set up sampling. You can say, I want to sample 10% out of my traffic. But that usually doesn't cut it, and then we started to go to more complex scenarios, and you find yourself working to sample the correct data. This is a place that I personally, in Specto, spent a lot of time creating a solution for that. So we're talking about a full deployment. Talking about the full deployment, that's a significant effort from the R&D. We need to have some way to show that it's actually doing something. And from my experience, trying to measure things like how faster did we solve an incident or things like that is very complex, and usually it's very prone to mistakes. So I would measure how many traces we viewed. It's right that OpenTelemetry is providing things like logs and metrics, but you probably had it beforehand. The new thing and the important thing that OpenTelemetry brings to the table is traces, and just count how many trace views you had. If you had many or the trend is increasing, that's starting to catch up in your organization. So we are at the phase that we have a full deployment. Everything is working. Everything is running. We got this full picture of the whole system. So we have all the data. The fact that you have data doesn't mean people are seeing it. We need to make sure that developers are exposed to it. And this is where the phase where we need to expand in the organization. Expanding into the organization, I would say that is divided into two things that personally I see that work. The first one is integration. You have your current workflow, the current tools that you work with, whether it's logs and dashboards and metrics. You can have integration with all of them. Doing as much integration as you can, expose the developers, the SRE, DevOps to this tool, and making sure that at the right time they have access to it. So it just increases the usage, and we want it to be used, right? We put so much effort into it, and if it's not used, it's not worth anything. So this is in terms of integration and actually tapping into the tools that you already have. In terms of processes, celebrate the wins with traces. You improved some performance. You had some operation that took 3 seconds, and you were able to reduce this to half a second. Show the trace before and after. This would do a great visualization to the fix, and would increase the awareness to what you can benefit from traces, and make sure that trace links are accessible from the R&D, and they are not like how to get from terms of access and permission and those kind of things. Last thing that I would mention, organizations sometimes choose to have low data retention on traces because they're costly. So instead of saving it to, let's say, 2 weeks, they choose to save it to 5 days or 3 days. That would result in the fact that you may look for traces that are already expired because of the data retention. So again, managing the cost is important, and thinking of the data retention and not keeping it too low is also significant. So this is helping you to expand with the R&D. And now you're an OpenTelemetry master, and you could lead the OpenTelemetry project and adoption in your organization, and you have everything that you need. Just before I'll go to questions, if you have, of course, is we have the OpenTelemetry Bootcamp. The OpenTelemetry Bootcamp is a free vendor-neutral resource, video resource, a 6 hours course, I would say, to learn OpenTelemetry from the basic to complex things in production. So everything you need to know about OpenTelemetry is there. So feel free to go and look at that. And after this session, after the question, if you want to stay and hear about the product aspect and how it can help you with adopting OpenTelemetry, feel free to stay. It will be a 5 minutes to show you that. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, let's go.
We already collected some throughout the session. Actually, starting from something that is a little bit big and looking into the future. OpenTelemetry, as you just shared, like it is very powerful and it collects a lot of data from many sources. What do you think about the future of it? Can it potentially replace CM systems, and what else potentially we can build on top of this data for the future?
Yeah, so OpenTelemetry, if you look at the data itself, it's telling you how your application behaves. It's telling you externally looking at the system to understand what it's doing and how it's doing it. And this means that you can do tons of things with it. You can understand the performance and whether it's working. You can validate it, which gets you to the testing and quality area. You could understand product usage, right? From perspective of what features are being consumed by which users. You can, of course, look at a security perspective from that. And I'm not sure that we need to go so far to the future. You would find products already doing it today. You would usually find smaller startups, so not big companies invested in that yet. But I think you can already see the seeds. So definitely you can base a lot of solution based on OpenTelemetry.
Cool, thank you. We'll say that actually more specific questions about Azure Insights and their support to OpenTelemetry, but I think we can make it a broader question of, many vendors like Azure Insights, they do have some support to OpenTelemetry. Some of them are more advanced, some are less, some are just in preview state, some are, if you can shed a little bit of light of like how different vendors are looking at it and what are the difference between, the plain vanilla OpenTelemetry and the distros and so on and so forth.
Yeah, of course. So OpenTelemetry has its own plain vanilla, as you said, distribution that is implementing OpenTelemetry in the simplest way. And then it's up to you to set it up to the vendor, to the open source that you are using. And I think there are 3 layers to using non-plain vanilla OpenTelemetry. The first one is the vendor that you're working with is kind enough to just get you started easier with less configuration. They took the plain vanilla one, they wrapped it a bit, they did some configuration, and they are not adding anything to it. It's just pointing to the right configuration. If that's the case, go for it. Yeah. The second layer is that they are doing some stuff that is specific to their system. They are extending the feature. They're doing some stuff that are missing in the OpenTelemetry solution. And in that case, this is where you're starting to not 100% be OpenTelemetry compliant, or not compliant, but you're starting to be a bit locked to the vendor. And that's starting to be a bit risky in terms of being vendor neutral. The last thing is vendors that are actually doing stuff that are not emitting pure OpenTelemetry. So it's based on OpenTelemetry, but they alter the data in such a way that if you change the destination to another vendor, it wouldn't work. The problem is that looking at those three layers, it's hard for you to look at the code and understand in which layer it is. Even though we are an OpenTelemetry vendor, and I would say go with the plain one. That's a big core promise of OpenTelemetry.
Got it. Okay. We do have some specific questions about Java, but maybe we will follow on that on the chat itself. I think that, yeah, we don't have any further questions for now, but feel free to continue sending them as Michael moving along.
Yeah, I browsed too quickly on that slide. It said thank you, but I missed the part that was important for you. There is a CNCF Slack, and we have a channel there called OpenTelemetry Bootcamp. You can join the CNCF Slack and then join our channel. I'm spending too much time there, so you can hit me up with questions, and I'll help you. The Java questions that you guys have, you can send it there, and I'll try to help. So the last thing that I promised you is a quick show of Aspecto, and this is the part we're starting to talk about our product and what we are doing. So let me quickly show you our product. So the first thing that was extremely important for us is that when developers are coming into our product, they'll be able to find the trace they are looking for fast. You're going to have tons of traces from a production environment, and finding it could be complex. Sometimes you just know the trace ID, so you search for the trace ID and find it. Sometimes you know that you have a specific user having some issues, and you can search on that. So that's giving you the ability to handle the incidents when you just know something went wrong with a specific user, with a specific account, or anything of that sort. And sometimes you know that there is a specific endpoint that you need to solve. So let's say that we know that purchase order post had an issue. So we're filtering on that. Now we will see traces that have this exact call, and we can jump into this call and see exactly how it looks. So we took the approach of trying to be as visual as possible, because we know that some developers are not that experienced with OpenTelemetry and how the system works. So you can see right here, we have the order service communicating with the user service and the stock service and a database and Kafka. So you can see this interaction with ease. You can also see the timeline. This is the exact same trace that we saw previously in the in the talk. And if you click a specific transaction, a specific span, you can see all the relevant data. You can see the request, you can see the response, you can see everything that you need in order to understand what's happening with this specific span. As I said earlier, it's good to start with synchronous in communication, because async communication is hard. In many cases, in most cases, when you're going to look at a span of Kafka, you would probably see that it produced a message, and you may be able to see that it was produced and the payload itself. But as you can see here, we can't see how this message was consumed. And in this case, you can see here that it was in fact consumed, and we can see the linked trace. And this is something that is not that easy to get working, and not supported in most vendors. And it was very important for us, because we know that when you produce a message, you want to see how it was consumed. And when you click on that, you can see the new trace, the trace that consumed the message, and we can see the message itself, and eventually how it was persisted to the database eventually, and you can see that. So this is like a quick view of Specto, and of course we have tons of more features and things to show you. And as you saw earlier, our log integration. Yeah, that's a brief view of Specto. And again, Thank you so much for staying with us and listening to us. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you all. I know that there has been some like a lot of talks about the Slack channel and so on in the chat. I tried to send it over here. If you didn't see it very well, we will edit the links to this talk. We will add this talk to our YouTube channel. We'd add as comments like all the links to the different blogs that we mentioned, to the Slack channel, to examples, and the slide themselves. So bear with us like for a few hours or tomorrow. You will be able to see all of that on our Slack channel. Other than that, follow us on social media, mainly Twitter and LinkedIn. Just look for Aspecto. We are publishing all content over there and future events. If you signed up to this event, we will make sure you know about future ones. And obviously, the Slack channel is also a very good way to keep you up to date with all the events out there. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Hope it was somewhat helpful. And anyway, if you miss anything, again, we will share everything in our YouTube channel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.